2 million human lives do not simply vanish from the earth without a crime being committed. In the late winter of 1944 and the early spring of 1945, a catastrophic famine swept through northern Vietnam, claiming the lives of roughly 10% of the entire population of the region. This was not a slow natural tragedy caused by a sudden drought or a failed harvest. This was a systematic administrative slaughter. Vietnam at the time was one of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth, a land that exported hundreds of thousands of tons of rice every single year. Yet, while millions of Vietnamese peasants were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and dry leaves, the granaries of the ruling elites were overflowing with grain. Who allowed this to happen? For decades, historians have debated where the ultimate guilt lies. Was it the French colonial administration, who had ruled the country with an iron fist for over half a century, and viewed the local population as mere economic units to be exploited? Was it the Imperial Japanese military, who occupied the land in 1940 and demanded astronomical quantities of food to fuel their war machine across Asia? Or was it a lethal, coordinated conspiracy of indifference, where both empires chose to sacrifice millions of innocent lives for their own geopolitical survival? To understand how a land of abundance became a mass grave, we must peel back the layers of propaganda, wartime excuses, and colonial silence to expose the dark truth of the 1945 famine. This was a disaster where food was weaponized, where bureaucratic signatures were as deadly as bullets, and where the suffering of millions was treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The tragedy was not that there was no food. The tragedy was that the food was locked away behind armed guards while the people who grew it starved to death on the streets outside. As we dive into this dark chapter of history, we must confront the uncomfortable questions of responsibility, complicity, and the terrifying ease with which empires can normalize mass atrocity. To understand the scale of the horror that unfolded in 1945, we must first look at the unique, suffocating political reality of Vietnam during the Second World War. For decades, the Vietnamese people had lived under the heavy yoke of French colonial rule. The French administration, driven by a desire for rubber, coal, and agricultural wealth, had structured the entire economy of Indochina to benefit the metropole in Paris. But in 1940, the global balance of power shattered. Nazi Germany invaded and occupied France, establishing the collaborationist Vichy regime. In Asia, the expanding empire of Japan saw an opportunity to cut off supply lines to China and secure a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia. When Japanese troops marched into Vietnam, the French colonial government, led by Governor-General Jean Decoux, made a cynical calculation. Rather than fighting to defend the territory, the Vichy French administration chose to collaborate with the Japanese occupiers. This created a bizarre, monstrous system known as the double yoke. For 5 long years, the Vietnamese people were forced to serve 2 colonial masters at the same time. The French retained their administrative power, their police force, and their tax collection systems, while the Japanese military held the real power, using Vietnam as a massive supply depot and a launching pad for their military campaigns. This arrangement was incredibly lucrative for both the French administrators and the Japanese military command, but for the ordinary Vietnamese peasant, it was a death sentence. The French colonial state had always extracted high taxes and forced labor, but now they had to meet the insatiable demands of a foreign military occupation force. To keep their own privileges and maintain the illusion of French sovereignty, Governor-General Decoux and his administration agreed to supply the Japanese army with whatever they needed. This meant that the agricultural wealth of Vietnam, which had sustained generations of families, was systematically diverted. The French collected the rice, the Japanese consumed or stockpiled it, and the Vietnamese people were left with nothing but the dust of their own fields. The double yoke squeezed the Vietnamese peasantry to the point of absolute exhaustion, leaving them with no reserves, no safety net, and no margin for error. The French administration went so far as to implement strict price controls and forced grain requisitions, ensuring that even in times of peace, the local population was kept at the bare minimum level of subsistence. The colonial authorities viewed the Vietnamese peasants not as citizens to be protected, but as an inexhaustible resource to be mined for the benefit of the empire. This fundamental disregard for human life laid the groundwork for the catastrophe that was to follow, as two foreign powers played a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess with the lives of millions of innocent people. The road to the Great Famine of 1945 was paved with deliberate, calculated administrative decisions that slowly choked the life out of the northern provinces. The first devastating blow came when the Japanese military ordered a massive shift in agricultural production. Because the Allied blockade was cutting off Japan from its global supply of raw materials, the Japanese army needed domestic sources of industrial materials. They ordered the French administration to force Vietnamese farmers to destroy their own rice crops and plant industrial crops instead. In some of the most fertile areas of the Red River Delta, fields that had grown nourishing rice for centuries were forcibly plowed under to plant jute for sandbags, cotton for military uniforms, and castor beans for aviation oil. Farmers who resisted were met with brutal violence from both French police and Japanese soldiers. At the same time, the French colonial government established a strict monopoly on the purchase and distribution of rice. They instituted a system of forced collection, where every farmer was legally required to sell a massive percentage of their harvest to the state at artificially low prices, often far below the actual cost of production. If a farmer failed to meet their quota, the colonial authorities would confiscate their land, arrest their family members, or seize whatever meager food reserves they had hidden. This collected rice was not used to feed the local population. Instead, it was stockpiled in massive warehouses to feed the Japanese occupation army, exported to support Japanese troops fighting in other parts of Asia, or converted into industrial alcohol to fuel Japanese military vehicles. To make matters worse, the year 1944 brought a series of severe natural disasters, including typhoons and insect infestations that crippled the autumn harvest. In normal times, a shortage in the north would be mitigated by shipping rice from the fertile Mekong Delta in the south. However, by late 1944, the United States and its allies had established complete air and naval dominance over Indochina. Allied bombers systematically targeted the transport infrastructure of Vietnam, destroying the Trans-Indochina Railway, bombing bridges, and sinking coastal shipping vessels. While this was done to disrupt Japanese military movements, it had a catastrophic side effect. It completely severed the food supply line between the South and the North. The South had an absolute surplus of rice, with grain literally rotting in warehouses because it could not be moved, while the North was plunging into a state of absolute starvation. The stage was set for an unprecedented humanitarian disaster, and the rulers of the land knew exactly what was coming. They watched the weather patterns, they analyzed the harvest reports, and they calculated the exact deficit of grain, yet they chose to prioritize military stockpiles over human survival. The French administration continued to enforce the collection quotas, and the Japanese continued to demand their grain, ensuring that the coming winter would be one of the darkest periods in human history. As the winter of 1944 turned into the early months of 1945, the accumulated weight of these policies crashed down upon the northern provinces of Vietnam, unleashing a horror of biblical proportions. The provinces of Tay Binh, Nam Dinh, Thanh Hoa, and Hung Yen became the epicenters of an absolute nightmare. With no rice reserves left, millions of peasants were forced to consume anything they could find to survive. They ate paddy husks, weeds, banana roots, and the bark of trees. When those ran out, they turned to rats, insects, and even the leather from their old shoes. As the cold winter winds swept across the flooded fields, starvation stripped away the human form, turning vibrant men, women, and children into walking skeletons. Their skins stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollow and vacant. Desperate to survive, hundreds of thousands of people abandoned their ancestral villages and began a slow, agonizing march toward the larger cities like Hanoi and Haiphong, hoping to find food or charity. The roads connecting the provinces to the cities became pathways of death. Every morning, colonial sanitation carts would drive along the roads to collect the bodies of those who had collapsed and died during the night. The scale of the dying was so immense that there was no time or space for traditional burials. Mass graves were hastily dug, where hundreds of nameless bodies were piled on top of each other. In Hanoi, the contrast between life and death was sharp enough to cause physical sickness. While thousands of starving peasants lay dying on the cold pavements outside, inside the grand colonial villas, French administrators and wealthy collaborators hosted lavish dinner parties, drinking fine wines and eating imported delicacies. The Japanese military command occupied the grandest hotels, their officers dining on high-quality rice that had been confiscated from the very people dying on the streets outside. The most damning aspect of this tragedy was that the granaries of Hanoi and Haiphong were not empty. They were packed to the rafters with hundreds of thousands of tons of rice, guarded by armed Japanese soldiers and French police. The colonial administration and the Japanese military refused to open these warehouses to the public, fearing that doing so would cause inflation, disrupt the military supply chain, or show weakness. They watched as millions of people starved to death outside their gates, choosing to protect their piles of grain rather than save human lives. This was not a passive failure of governance, it was an active, daily decision to let people die. The screams of the starving echoed through the streets of Hanoi, a haunting soundtrack to the absolute moral bankruptcy of the colonial and occupying powers, who valued their bureaucratic order and military logistics far more than the lives of the people they claimed to rule. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe scenes of unimaginable despair, where mothers were forced to abandon their dying infants on the roadsides, and families made pacts to die together in their homes rather than face the slow agony of starvation in public. The air in the northern provinces was thick with the smell of decay, and the silence of abandoned villages was broken only by the cawing of crows. Yet, even as the death toll mounted into the hundreds of thousands, the bureaucratic machinery of both empires continued to grind on, recording the grain shipments and balancing the ledgers with cold, sociopathic efficiency. The political landscape shifted dramatically on March 9, 1945, but the suffering of the Vietnamese people did not end. Sensing that the Allied forces were closing in and fearing a French betrayal, the Japanese military launched a sudden coup d'état, arresting French officials, disarming French troops, and ending over 80 years of French colonial rule in a single night. The Japanese declared Vietnam an independent nation under a puppet government led by Emperor Bao Dai and Prime Minister Tran Trong Kim. But this independence was a cruel mockery. The Japanese military retained absolute control over the country's resources, and they refused to halt the forced collection of rice. In fact, the famine reached its peak during these months of transition. The new, weak Vietnamese administration had no real power, no resources, and no transport network to bring relief to the starving population. It was during this darkest hour that a revolutionary force emerged as the only group willing to take decisive action. The Viet Minh, a nationalist coalition led by Ho Chi Minh, recognized that the famine was not just a humanitarian tragedy, but a powerful symbol of the failure of both French and Japanese rule. They launched a highly coordinated campaign with a simple, electrifying slogan: "Break open the rice granaries to resolve the famine." Across northern and central Vietnam, Viet Minh cadres led groups of starving peasants in armed raids on the tightly guarded Japanese and colonial warehouses. They seized the stockpiled rice and distributed it directly to the local population. For millions of starving people, these raids were the difference between life and death. This act of direct action transformed the political consciousness of the peasantry. They saw that while the French had fled and the Japanese continued to hoard food, the Viet Minh were willing to fight and die to feed them. The famine became the catalyst that mobilized the masses, uniting the rural peasantry with the urban nationalists. When the Japanese Empire finally surrendered to the Allies in August 1945, the Viet Minh were poised to seize power, launching the August Revolution and declaring the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The memory of the empty granaries and the revolutionary salvation that followed became the foundational mythos of the new Vietnamese state, forever linking the struggle for independence with the basic human right to survive. This was a turning point where the starving masses realized that their survival depended not on the charity of foreign masters, but on their own collective power to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The raids on the granaries were not just acts of desperation. They were the first shots of a revolution that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia for the next 3 decades. When we look back at the 1945 famine, we are forced to confront a disturbing truth. This was a catastrophe born entirely of human choices, political calculations, and imperial greed. It was a man-made famine, where food was weaponized and human lives were treated as completely disposable. For decades after the war, the parties involved engaged in a shameful game of historical finger-pointing. The French blamed the Japanese for occupying the territory and demanding impossible quotas of rice. The Japanese blamed the French for their administrative failures, and the Allied forces for bombing the transport lines. The Allies largely ignored the tragedy, viewing it as a minor footnote in the grand narrative of their victory in the Pacific. But the historical record reveals a shared guilt that cannot be washed away. The French colonial administration actively collaborated with the occupiers, choosing to sacrifice their colonial subjects to preserve their own administrative comfort and power. The Japanese military showed an absolute sociopathic disregard for human life, treating the Vietnamese population as nothing more than fuel for their war machine. And the Allied forces, while fighting a just war against fascism, accepted the collateral damage of starving millions by destroying the infrastructure that kept them alive. The lesson of 1945 is a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked imperial power and the terrifying ease with which bureaucratic systems can normalize mass atrocity. When empires clash, it is always the innocent, the voiceless, and the vulnerable who pay the ultimate price. The 2 million people who died in the fields of Binh and the streets of Hanoi were not victims of a natural disaster. They were the victims of a global system that valued geopolitical dominance over human survival. This tragedy reminds us that famine is rarely a simple matter of crop failure. It is almost always a failure of human empathy, a breakdown of political responsibility, and a crime committed by those who hold power over the distribution of life-saving resources. We must learn to look past the official narratives and the sanitized reports of wartime governments to see the human cost of their decisions. The legacy of the 1945 famine is a solemn reminder that we must hold those in power accountable, for when we allow human lives to be reduced to mere numbers on a spreadsheet, we pave the way for the next great tragedy. The memory of the 1945 famine remains a deep, unhealed wound in the collective consciousness of Vietnam, yet it is a tragedy that is shockingly absent from most global history textbooks. While the world remembers the horrors of the European theater or the nuclear bombings of Japan, the 2 million souls lost in the Red River Delta are often forgotten by international history. We must ask ourselves why some tragedies are memorialized while others are swept under the rug of historical amnesia. It is our responsibility to remember these stories, to honor the memory of those who perished, and to ensure that such a crime is never allowed to happen again. The victims of this famine were not just statistics, they were parents, children, artists, and farmers, each with a name, a story, and a future that was brutally stolen from them. By keeping their memory alive, we refuse to let their killers succeed in erasing them from history. What do you think about this dark chapter of history? Do you believe the primary blame lies with the French colonial administration, who prioritized their own comfort and prestige, or the Japanese military, who ruthlessly extracted the country's resources for their war machine? Or do you believe that the Allied forces also bear a share of the responsibility for destroying the vital transport lines that could have saved millions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, as we want to foster a respectful and deep discussion on this crucial topic. If you believe that stories like this need to be told, that the voices of the forgotten deserve to be heard by a global audience, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support is vital in helping us conduct the deep research necessary to bring these overlooked historical narratives to light, with the accuracy and depth they deserve. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us today, for honoring the memory of the lost, and for being a part of our community. We look forward to reading your comments, and we will see you in the next video.